Welcome to this next installment of the video lecture series for Theology of Religions, Part 2b. And again, thanks for abiding by the fair use notice that governs the content in this video. You'll recall that in Part 1, I situated the theology of religions locus in the larger context of systematic theology, defining some important terms as well as 3 tasks that are central to this aspect of God talk. And we'll review those quickly before we move into a discussion or my presentation of some important data about religious variety in the world that helps us attend to these 3 tasks when we as we attend to theology of religions. And then you'll then this is all laying the groundwork for Part 3, where I'll be highlighting some themes from Veli-Matti Karkkainen's book. So Theology of Religions is our speech about 3 things. First, the theological meaning and value of other religions. Second, how we are good neighbors to people of other traditions. And third, how we think about Christianity as one among the world's religions. Now, part of what this involves is paying attention to religious traditions and dialogue. Paul Knitter, as I pointed out in Part 2, has this fairly potent quotation that there will be no peace among nations unless there is peace among religions, and there will be no peace among religions unless there is greater, more effective dialogue among them. But if there's going to be effective dialogue, we need to have a framework for thinking about what dialogue is. And so this is where I'm borrowing from Lisa Shirk and David Kamp's work in the Little Book of Dialogue for Difficult Subjects, where they explain that dialogue is a communication process that aims to build relationships between people as they share experiences, ideas, and information about a common concern. Dialogue is also intended to help groups take in information, and more perspectives than they previously had as they attempt to forge a new and broader understanding of a situation. So in this regard, I'm offering this data content as a way of contributing to the new and more information that we need to have to shape our perspectives around theology of religions. So with that, let's turn now to look at some of this data. And again, I'm drawing on data provided by the Global Landscape Study done by the Pew Research Center. And I've linked that website to our content on Moodle. So what is religious variety like? Here's one map that shows the dispersion of various traditions around the world. But here I've put some of this data in bar graph form so that you can see when it comes to the global population of people all around the world. 2.2 billion people identify as Christians, 1.6 billion Muslim, 1.1 billion are unaffiliated. There are 1 billion Hindus in the world, 50 million Buddhists, 40 million folk religionists, 14 million Jews, and 58 million other. Folk religionists describes the category of adherence to various forms of indigenous religions. So you can think about American Indian traditions or indigenous First Nations people in the Americas, Aboriginal traditions in places like Australia, traditional Chinese folk medicine, or folk traditions, in China, and so on and so forth. But let's make this bar graph a little bit more meaningful. And what we're going to do now is take a look at a pie chart, the same information in a pie chart, to see how these stacks of billions and millions of people look in terms of percentages of the world's population. So 32% of the world's population identifies as Christian, 23% as Muslim, 16% as unaffiliated, 15% is Hindu, 7% is Buddhist, 6% folk religionist, and then 1% describes other, and then the Jewish population is under 1%. So now we're going to go region by region to see how these populations are dispersed. First, and let me add here quickly too that other includes adherence to the Baha'i faith, Taoism, Jainism, Shintoism, Sikhism, Tenrikyo, Wicca, Zoroastrianism, and other small groups. If you would like to see a full list, visit the Pew website. So now we're going to go kind of region by region, and there were 6 regions in this study: North America, Latin America and the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and Northern Africa, Europe, Asia and the Pacific, and I think that's our 6. So in North America, 77% of people describe themselves as Christians and 17% as unaffiliated. The Jewish population comes in at 2%, and everything else is beneath that, some fraction of at 1 or some fraction of between 1 and 2%. Moving south to Latin America and the Caribbean, we see a pretty significant shift. The Christian population comes up by almost 20% to 90%, the unaffiliated to 8%, and then the next sizable percentage is the Muslim community at 2%. In Europe, Christianity represents 75% of the religious landscape, with the unaffiliated at 18% and Islam at 6%. So you can see that that's a significant difference between Europe and the Americas. Moving to Sub-Saharan Africa, Christianity makes up 63% of the population, with Islam at 30%. The unaffiliated and folk religionists both come in at 3%. When we go to the Middle East and North Africa, Islam shifts here to 93% of the population, and Christianity is down to 4%. The Jewish population is at 2%, which is comparable to what it is in the United States, specifically as part of the North American landscape. In Asia and the Pacific, we see a much different kind of distribution of the traditions. At 24%, or 25% is Hinduism, 24% is Islam, 21% unaffiliated. Buddhism is at 12%, folk religions at 9%, Christianity at 7%, and other at 1%. So continuing on with this kind of who is where distribution kind of theme, we're now going to take a look at each tradition and see how they are spread out among the various regions. So first we're going to start with Christianity. So there are 2.2 billion Christians worldwide, but where do they live? What's really, and this is pretty striking to me, given some of the other, and I double checked the numbers, given some of the other dispersions. So while there is a large percentage of the North American population that identifies as Christian, when you look at the totality of where Christians are, Christians in North America only make up 12% of the Christian population. This is followed then by 13% in Asia and the Pacific. 1% of the Christian population, of the Christian world, lives in the Middle East and North Africa. The highest concentrations of Christians are in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Europe. Again, I was going through this the first time, and I had to go back and check my numbers. It's pretty amazing. Then moving to the Muslim pie chart. Islam, adherents to Islam make up 1.6 billion people, but how is that distributed? Well, 62% of the Muslim population is found in the region of Asia and Pacific. Then 20% in the Middle East and North Africa, 16% in Sub-Saharan Africa, and 3% in Europe. Then moving to the unaffiliated, who make up 1.1 billion of the world's population, the highest percentage of that 1.1 billion is in Asia and the Pacific, 76% in fact. And then from there you can see the breakdown: 5% in North America, 4% in Latin America and the Caribbean, 12% in Europe, and 2% in Sub-Saharan Africa. Hinduism. There are 1 billion Hindus in the world, and 99% of them live in Asia, the Asia-Pacific region. Like that's just astounding, right? we see a similar dynamic with Buddhism, with 1% of the Buddhist population living in North America and 99% of the 5 million Buddhists in the world living in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific region. Folk religionists, 90% of them, of the 400 million worldwide, are also in Asia, the Asia-Pacific region. The Jewish population is pretty much evenly distributed between North America and the Middle East, although there is a sizable Jewish population in Europe at 10%, with 3% in Latin America and the Caribbean. Of the 58 million practitioners of other religions, again, 89% of them were in the Asia-Pacific region, 4% in North America, and 3% in sub-Saharan Africa. So I've presented this data. Your head is probably spinning, but what does all of this mean? Well, let me offer a little summary statement with some additional reflections. To develop our speech about the theological meaning and value of other religions, Christianity is one among the world's religions, and how we Christians are good neighbors to people of other traditions, requires we have meaningful contact with people of other traditions, and that can be difficult given this data that we just looked at. Demographics may be against us. So while there are Christians all around the world, Christians are in different concentrations around the world. So that attempting to be a good neighbor to a Buddhist, if you live in North America, can be very difficult. But if you are living in Asia and the Pacific, in that region, you may have lots of opportunity to encounter someone who is Buddhist. But again, you might be in the minority, and so there is the majority-minority dynamic is at work here. And in that sense, demographics may be against us. We know that politics, national cultures, and history certainly are against us. This is indicative of what Paul Knitter had to say in that earlier quotation. And I would add that not every adherent to every tradition has theological education. Now, I don't mean to be a snob or an elitist when I say that. Rather, what I mean to invoke here is a dynamic that I have experienced around interracial dialogue. Interreligious and interfaith dialogue, I think, carries with it similar challenges to conversations about race. So, for example, I live in Elkhart, where there is a fairly Elkhart, compared to Goshen or Middlebury or other towns and cities and villages in Elkhart County, is a fairly racially diverse and mixed community. But just because a person is Black or Latino or Asian or so on and so forth, doesn't mean that they necessarily have reflected critically on what their racial identity means and how they integrate their racial identity into their life. The same thing goes for interreligious and interfaith dialogue. Just because a person is Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Baha'i, so on and so forth, doesn't mean that they have deeply integrated their religious and faith identity into their overall worldview in a way that allows them to speak thoughtfully, critically, or reflectively about the nature of the faith that is alive in them, right? We all know plenty of Christians who are Christians, it kind of seems, because that's kind of how they grew up. And the same is true of adherence to other traditions. So that just because I have a Muslim neighbor doesn't mean that my Muslim neighbor is ready to enter into a deep dialogue with me, even if I want to be in dialogue with them. So that becomes, I think, a bit of a challenge, especially if what we are seeking in by way of dialogue is something deep and meaningful. again, an exchange of theological ideas and constructions and conceptions. The other thing that I think is probably also operative, and here the intercultural development inventory provides us with some helpful framing for thinking about these issues with its developmental spectrum, is that if you are in a religious minority, and here I'm thinking about Christians in Asia, and I'm also thinking about non-Christians in North America or Europe. There is a certain amount of minimization that can happen. You don't want to get on the wrong side of people because you have the faith, you are part of the faith tradition that you are part of. And so you might minimize your faith tradition, your religious identity, or you might relegate your tradition to a kind of cultural thing. So that these are all strategies that we can use, understandably, to minimize religious difference, because we don't want to be perceived as troublemakers, or because we want acceptance. These are very understandable human needs that we might strategize around. So that to think about and develop a theology of religions, it serves different functions, I think, for different people depending on where you are literally in the world. Speaking personally and for myself, because I would say that this is a locus that is underdeveloped in my own experience of being a Christian and my own experience of being a neighbor, right? So that my primary, or my kind of embedded theology around theology of religions is this wanting people to know that they belong in my community, even if they practice or adherence to a tradition that is different than mine. At the same time, I also tend to have a kind of hermeneutics of suspicion, because I am a US born and raised American Christian. That means I have some assumptions about forms of government, like representative democracies. I've never lived in a theocratic context before, so that I tend to be fairly suspicious of of traditions that do move toward, even of Christianity, that move toward that kind of understanding. That's going to put me at in a different place with some Muslims, where there is a bit more of a model of theocratic oriented worldview. Yeah, so I have to be real about some of my biases, and this gets back to Paul Nitter's stance of openness. So that for me to work at developing a theology of religions is also an invitation to a kind of kenosis and a deeper exploration of some of the ways that my worldview has some hidden assumptions in it around the relationship between or assumptions about free practice and expression of religion, okay, and the way that that can connect with a political stance or a political identity. Now, I'm not sure what your experience is of these kinds of issues. I also can say that as a kid, I was exposed to difference around religious and faith expressions. And I was encouraged to nurture my curiosity around that. At the same time, when you're a kid, it's hard to understand and comprehend the function of religion and faith in your life and in the life of your family. We can recognize sort of sociologically, well, we go to this church and they go to that kind of church, and we pray in different ways, but we both pray. And so how do we interpret similarity and how do we interpret difference? And what does that difference mean? These, again, I would say, are some areas of my own theology of religions that are underdeveloped. So I offer this all to you by way of a kind of confessional stance, and to recognize that this, to think theologically in this arena is a complex task. In part 3, we will dig a little bit more into some of the biblical material because we haven't resourced ourselves yet in that way, so know that that is coming. And how do we create Christian containers for us to wrestle with some of that kind of material, as we also work at integrating our own autobiography around exposure to different traditions. This is some of what we'll look at as the lecture continues with part 3.